In the spring of 1969, an American helicopter door gunner named Ronald Ridenhour started mailing letters to Congress, the Pentagon, and the White House. He hadn't witnessed anything firsthand, but he was deeply haunted by the secondhand stories he'd heard from other servicemen. The letters contained a horrifying allegation that American troops had deliberately and systematically murdered several hundred unarmed civilians in a cluster of small South Vietnamese hamlets. But those allegations directly contradicted the official military record from the exact date in question. As this side-by-side comparison shows, the Army's paperwork from March 16, 1968, described the operation as a significant, decorated combat victory against entrenched Viet Cong forces. Looking specifically at the official data on the left, this record lists a reported 128 enemy combatants killed in action, alongside exactly 0 civilian casualties. This massive discrepancy leaves us with 2 urgent questions. What actually took place inside that village that morning, and how did a mass slaughter get written down as a triumphant military victory? Pulling the thread on this single buried incident would eventually unravel the ethical narrative the United States was telling itself about the war. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the ground conditions a year earlier. By early 1968, following the massive shock of the Tet Offensive, American forces were under immense pressure to root out enemy fighters hiding in the countryside. Charlie Company, part of the Americal Division, was exhausted and heavily demoralized. For weeks, they had been losing men to landmines and hidden snipers in the surrounding area, taking casualties without ever actually seeing the enemy who was shooting at them. Going into this specific operation, their intelligence briefing told them that the hamlets making up My Lai were a highly fortified Viet Cong stronghold, and that all innocent civilians would have already left for the local market. You have a unit suffering deep psychological fatigue, facing an invisible enemy, and operating on completely false information. The men were effectively primed for a disaster before they even stepped off the helicopters. When Charlie Company entered the village on the morning of March 16th, they braced themselves for heavy combat. Instead, they found 0 armed resistance, and no enemy fire was ever returned. The soldiers found ordinary villagers going about their morning routine. The population they encountered consisted almost entirely of women, children, and elderly residents. Despite the complete lack of threat, the platoon leader on the ground, Lieutenant William Calley, took horrifying action. He directed his men to corral the unarmed villagers into groups and systematically shoot them. Over the next few hours, the soldiers burned homes, killed the livestock, and completely erased the village. Investigators later estimated that between 300 and 500 unarmed people were killed. The violence only stopped when a helicopter pilot named Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson saw what was happening from above. He landed his aircraft directly between fleeing civilians and advancing American soldiers, and ordered his door gunners to open fire on any U.S. troops who continued shooting at the villagers. A pilot threatening to gun down his own comrades is a staggering break in military protocol. Thompson's willingness to fire on fellow Americans identifies the morning for what it was, a recognizable, deliberate massacre that overrode every instinct of military loyalty. In the immediate aftermath, the military chain of command moved quickly to bury the reality of that morning. They filed reports detailing a massive tactical victory, inflated the enemy body counts, and completely omitted any mention of civilian deaths. That fabricated official version stood entirely unchallenged for 18 months, until Ronald Ridenhour finally mailed those letters in 1969, forcing the Army to launch a quiet internal inquiry into the rumors. The truth didn't reach the American public through the military, but through an independent investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh. He managed to track down and interview Lieutenant Calley directly, publishing a detailed report that finally exposed the atrocity to the world in November 1969. Hersh's story was rapidly syndicated nationwide, running alongside graphic, devastating photographs taken by an Army combat photographer who had been on the ground that day. With raw visual proof printed in morning papers across the country, the military lost all control over the narrative, and the 18-month cover-up completely collapsed. The public reaction was visceral and immediate. American citizens were suddenly confronted with undeniable proof that their own military had committed horrific atrocities, sparking intense outrage and widespread protests. The intense pressure led to congressional hearings and a formal military investigation. Eventually, more than 24 officers were officially charged for their roles in either the massacre itself or the institutional cover-up that followed. But despite the vast scale of the crime and the sheer number of people involved in hiding it, the legal system ultimately convicted only one man, Lieutenant Calley, who was found guilty of premeditated murder. Even then, President Richard Nixon intervened within days of the sentencing. Calley's life sentence was quickly reduced, and he ended up serving just over 3 years under house arrest. The massacre and the subsequent failure of accountability signaled a profound collapse in the war's moral conduct. For many, My Lai served as final proof that the conflict had moved beyond a failure of strategy into a failure of conscience. Picture this. It's December 1969. You're a young American man sitting in your living room, staring at the television. You're watching a hand reach into a large glass jar to pull out a small plastic capsule. Inside that capsule is a birth date. If your birthday was drawn and read aloud on live TV, your fate was sealed. The government was calling you up to serve, sending you thousands of miles away to fight in the jungles of Southeast Asia. So how exactly did the military decide who went to fight and who stayed behind? Why did thousands of young men suddenly choose federal prison over military service? And how did a protest over a foreign conflict end with American soldiers firing on American college students? By 1970, the combat had crossed the ocean. The conflict split the country directly along generational lines, turning dinner tables, college campuses, and city streets into battlegrounds of their own. To understand this domestic fracture, we have to look at how the draft actually worked. For most of the war, the military relied on conscription to fill its ranks, but there was a catch: deferments. If you were enrolled in college or held certain exempt jobs, you didn't have to go. This chart shows how that draft burden was distributed across different economic classes. Working class and lower income men who couldn't afford college tuition were sent straight to the front lines, while the sons of wealthier, well-connected families found legal pathways to stay out of combat. Public anger over this clear class division forced the government's hand. To make the process appear fair, they introduced the televised draft lottery in December 1969, stripping away exemptions and leaving everything to chance. But the randomness of the lottery triggered mass resistance. Tens of thousands of drafted men fled across the northern border to Canada. Others publicly burned their draft cards, declared themselves conscientious objectors, and voluntarily went to prison rather than participate. Mechanizing the draft didn't make the system feel equitable. It simply forced the public to confront the underlying inequities of who was being asked to die for a war they increasingly did not support. At the exact same time, the reality of the front lines was being broadcast directly into American homes. Nightly graphic television coverage, rising casualty reports, and the exposure of atrocities like the My Lai Massacre directly contradicted the optimistic progress reports the government was feeding the public. This widening credibility gap fueled an organized counterculture. By August 1969, nearly 500,000 young people gathered at a farm in upstate New York for the Woodstock Festival. Music and youth culture had fully aligned against the establishment and the conflict it was managing. In the spring of 1970, President Richard Nixon announced that American forces were expanding their military operations across the border into Cambodia. To a weary public, expanding the operation looked exactly like a broken promise to wind the conflict down. Furious students organized strikes on university campuses across the nation. At Kent State University in Ohio, the protests escalated over several days, culminating in students burning down the campus ROTC building. In response to the unrest, the Ohio governor declared a state of emergency and ordered armed National Guard troops onto the university grounds to force an end to the demonstrations. A political calculation made in Washington regarding a foreign country had directly resulted in heavily armed soldiers facing off against American college students in the Midwest. On May 4th, the campus was locked in a tense standoff. Guard units formed a line facing a crowd of rallying students. The soldiers were hot, exhausted, reportedly low on tear gas and ammunition, and increasingly anxious about the hostile crowd. Then, the line broke. In a span of just 13 seconds, guardsmen raised their rifles and fired directly into the crowd. Bullets struck students who were hundreds of feet away. Some of the victims weren't even participating in the rally. They were simply walking across the grass to their next class. 4 students were killed and 9 others wounded. Subsequent investigations found that none of the students who were shot were close enough to pose any credible physical threat to the armed soldiers. The killings sent a shockwave across the entire country. Almost overnight, millions of students walked out of their classrooms, forcing hundreds of colleges and universities to shut down entirely for the remainder of the semester. After Kent State, the anti-war movement was no longer limited to college radicals. The parents of drafted sons began joining the picket lines. Soon, returning soldiers themselves organized against the conflict, marching on Washington in their own military uniforms to protest a war they had personally fought. The national consensus had finally broken. Public opinion polls revealed that, for the first time, a clear majority of Americans believed that entering the conflict had been a mistake. A country that had entered the decade largely unified behind its leaders found itself deeply fractured. The domestic fallout left behind a lingering, profound distrust of government institutions, a divide that would persist long after the last troops came home.